The silence in the cockpit was deafening. 20,000 feet above the Nevada desert, surrounded by nothing but blue sky and the distant hum of a Pratt & Whitney engine, I finally understood what they meant when they said flying changes you. But this wasn't supposed to be my moment. This wasn't supposed to be my jet. According to everyone at Nellis Air Force Base, I was just Rebecca Martinez, the cadet who didn't belong here. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. 3 years earlier, I was stocking shelves at a grocery store in Bakersfield, California, watching fighter jets streak across the sky from Edwards Air Force Base. Most people barely notice them anymore, but I couldn't take my eyes off those silver streaks cutting through the desert air. My manager, an overweight man named Doug who smelled perpetually of stale coffee, would always shake his head when he caught me staring. "Those pilots are a different breed, Rebecca," he'd say, adjusting his crooked name tag. "They come from military families, went to fancy academies. People like us, we keep our feet on the ground." Doug meant well, but he didn't understand the fire that burned in my chest every time I heard those engines roar overhead. My father had been a mechanic at a small auto shop until his back gave out when I was 16. My mother cleaned houses for wealthy families in the hills, coming home each night with stories about their perfect children who attended private schools and summer camps I couldn't even pronounce. We lived in a 2-bedroom apartment where the air conditioning only worked when you hit it just right, and dinner was often whatever was marked down in the store's clearance section. The idea of flying seemed as distant as the moon. But something changed the day I met Captain Sarah Chen at the local community college. She was there for a recruitment presentation, standing rigid in her dress blues, talking to a room of maybe 15 students about opportunities in the Air Force. Most of the kids were on their phones, clearly there for the extra credit their professors had promised. I sat in the front row, hanging on every word. "The Air Force doesn't care where you come from," Captain Chen said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made everyone sit up straighter. "It cares where you're going. It cares about your dedication, your intelligence, and your willingness to push beyond what you think is possible." After the presentation, I approached her. My hands were shaking, and I could feel sweat forming on my palms despite the classroom's aggressive air conditioning. "Captain Chen," I started, my voice barely above a whisper, "I want to be a pilot." She looked at me for a long moment, studying my face with the intensity of someone accustomed to reading people quickly and accurately. "What's your educational background?" "I'm working on my associate's degree in general studies. I work part-time to help support my family." The words felt inadequate, like trying to explain a symphony using only 3 notes. "Math and science grades?" "A's in everything I've taken so far." Captain Chen nodded slowly. "The path to becoming a pilot is long and difficult. It starts with officer candidate school, then undergraduate pilot training. Many people who think they want to fly wash out in the first few weeks. The physical demands alone eliminate a significant percentage of candidates." "Do you?" She stepped closer, and I could see the small scar above her left eyebrow, probably from some training accident she'd never talk about. Because wanting something and being willing to sacrifice everything for it are 2 completely different things. That night, I went home and spread every piece of information Captain Chen had given me across our small kitchen table. The requirements seemed overwhelming: a bachelor's degree, passing the Air Force officer qualifying test, completing officer candidate school, surviving undergraduate pilot training, and then advanced training specific to whatever aircraft you'd eventually fly. The process could take years, and there was no guarantee of success at any stage. My mother found me there at 2 in the morning, still reading through the packet of information. "Misha, what is all this?" she asked in Spanish, settling into the chair across from me with a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. I explained everything: the presentation, the requirements, the dream that felt both impossible and inevitable. My mother listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of acknowledgement. When I finished, she was quiet for several minutes. "Your father always said you had your grandfather's eyes," she finally said. "My father was a pilot in Mexico, flew cargo planes over the mountains. He died when I was young, but I remember how he talked about flying, like it was breathing." I had never heard this story before. Why didn't you ever tell me? Because dreaming can be dangerous when you don't have the means to chase those dreams. But you're different, Rebecca. You're stronger than I was at your age, and you're smarter than your father and I ever imagined we could be. The next morning, I called Captain Chen and told her I wanted to begin the process. "Are you sure?" she asked. "Once we start this, there's no going back. If you fail at any stage, you'll still have served your commitment to the Air Force, just not as a pilot." "I'm sure." The first step was completing my bachelor's degree, which meant transitioning from part-time to full-time student while working even more hours at the grocery store to make up for the lost income. I switched my major to aerospace engineering, despite having never taken a physics course beyond high school. The academic workload was crushing, but every time I wanted to quit, I'd step outside and listen for the sound of jets overhead. My professors at the State University were a mixed bag. Some, like Dr. Michael Rodriguez in the engineering department, took genuine interest in my goals and pushed me to excel. Others seemed skeptical that someone from my background could handle the rigor of their courses. Professor Janet Williams, who taught advanced calculus, made a point of calling on me during every class session, seemingly hoping to catch me unprepared. "Miss Martinez," she'd say, her voice dripping with the kind of condescension that suggested she'd already decided I didn't belong there. "Perhaps you can explain the application of this theorem?" I always could. I spent every free moment studying, turning our small apartment into a fortress of textbooks and study guides. My mother would tiptoe around me during finals week, bringing me sandwiches and coffee while I worked through problem sets until my eyes burned. The physical preparation was just as demanding as the academic work. I started running before dawn, adding distance each week until I could cover 6 miles without stopping. I joined the university's boxing club, not because I enjoyed getting hit, but because I needed to understand how my body responded to stress and pain. The other students in the club were mostly young men who seemed to view my presence as either amusing or irritating. "You know female pilots don't need to be able to fight, right?" said Tommy Nakamura, a cocky sophomore who claimed his uncle had been a Navy SEAL. He said this while nursing a split lip I'd given him during sparring practice. "You know pilots of any gender need to be able to handle stress, right?" I replied, unwrapping my hands with deliberate slowness. The testing phase began during my senior year. The Air Force officer qualifying test was held at a military entrance processing station 3 hours from campus. I arrived early, sitting in my car in the parking lot watching other candidates file into the building. They looked like they belonged there. Confident, polished, many of them carrying themselves with the kind of military bearing that suggested they'd grown up around bases and ceremonies. The test itself was a blur of mathematical reasoning, verbal analogies, and spatial perception questions. Some sections felt natural, like extensions of the engineering coursework I'd been grinding through for years. Others, particularly the aviation-specific portions, required drawing on every documentary, book, and article about flying I'd consumed since meeting Captain Chen. When the results came back 6 weeks later, I had scored high enough to qualify for pilot training. Captain Chen called me personally to deliver the news. "Congratulations, Rebecca, you're invited to Officer Candidate School at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. Report date is in 3 months." I hung up the phone and sat in my car outside the grocery store where I was about to start my shift. Doug knocked on my window, probably wondering why I looked like I'd seen a ghost. "Everything okay?" "I'm going to be a pilot," I said, the words feeling strange and wonderful in my mouth. Doug laughed, not unkindly. "Sure you are, kid. Come on, we've got a truck delivery to unload." 3 months later, I was standing on a bus at Maxwell Air Force Base, surrounded by 89 other candidates who would spend the next 12 weeks learning whether they had what it took to become Air Force officers. The drill instructors who greeted us made it clear that many of us wouldn't make it to graduation. "Look to your left," shouted Technical Sergeant Patricia Hayes, a woman who couldn't have weighed more than 120 pounds but commanded absolute attention. "Look to your right. Statistically, one of the 3 of you won't be here in 6 weeks." Officer Candidate School was designed to break down everything you thought you knew about yourself and rebuild it according to Air Force standards. We learned to march in formation, memorize chain of command structures, and maintain equipment to standards that seemed impossibly precise. Every day began at 0500 hours, with physical training that left most of us barely able to climb the stairs to our dormitory rooms. But the hardest part wasn't the physical demands or even the academic requirements. It was learning to function as part of a unit while maintaining the individual excellence required of future officers. During our third week, my flight was assigned a group project involving tactical planning exercises. My flightmate, a guy named Kevin Patterson from Virginia, whose father was a retired colonel, made it clear he thought I was dragging down the team's performance. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. "Martinez, you're overthinking this," he said during a particularly frustrating planning session. "Some of us actually grew up around the military. Maybe let the people who know what they're doing take the lead." I spent that night in the latrine, crying quietly while scrubbing my boots. Not because Kevin had hurt my feelings, but because I was starting to wonder if he was right. Maybe wanting something badly enough wasn't the same as being capable of achieving it. Maybe Doug and Professor Williams and all the others who'd looked at me with skeptical eyes had seen something I was too stubborn to acknowledge. The next morning, Technical Sergeant Hayes pulled me aside after physical training. "Candidate Martinez, walk with me." We walked in silence for several minutes, past the dormitories and toward the flight line where training aircraft sat gleaming in the Alabama sun. "You're struggling," she said finally. It wasn't a question. "Yes, Sergeant." "Why?" The question was simple, but the answer felt complicated. How do you explain the weight of carrying other people's doubts along with your own? How do you describe the exhaustion that comes from constantly proving you belong somewhere? "I feel like I'm fighting two battles," I said finally. The one everyone else is fighting to meet the standards, and another one to prove I deserve to be fighting the first battle at all. Technical Sergeant Hayes stopped walking and turned to face me. "Candidate Martinez, do you know why I became a drill instructor?" "No, Sergeant." "Because 20 years ago, I was standing exactly where you're standing right now. Wondering if I belonged, wondering if wanting something was enough, wondering if the people who said I didn't fit were right." She paused, studying my face with the same intensity Captain Chen had shown in that community college classroom. "The Air Force taught me that the only opinion that matters is the one you have of yourself. If you believe you belong here, you do. If you don't, you don't." That night, I called my mother from the payphone outside our dormitory. It was the first time I'd spoken to her since arriving at OCS. "How are you doing, Mija?" "It's harder than I thought it would be." "Good," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "If it was easy, everyone would do it." Graduating from officer candidate school should have felt like a victory, but standing in formation wearing my new second lieutenant bars, I felt more like I was at the starting line of an even more challenging race. Undergraduate pilot training at Laughlin Air Force Base in Texas awaited, and everyone knew that's where dreams went to die. The statistics were brutal. Roughly 30% of students who began pilot training never made it to graduation. Of those who did graduate, only the top performers got their first choice of aircraft assignment. Fighter jets, F-16s, F-22s, F-35s. Those went to maybe 5% of each class. The rest would fly cargo planes, tankers, or transport aircraft. Respectable assignments, but not what I'd been dreaming about since those afternoons watching contrails over Bakersfield. My first day at Laughlin, I met my flight instructor, Major David Thompson, a former F-16 pilot who'd been reassigned to training duty after an injury grounded him from combat operations. He had the weathered look of someone who'd spent years pulling G-forces and a reputation for being brutally honest about his students' prospects. "Martinez," he said, flipping through my file during our initial meeting. "Good grades at OCS, solid AFOQT scores. Say you want fighters." "Yes, sir." Everyone wants fighters. The question is whether you have what it takes to earn one. He closed the file and looked at me directly. "I'm going to tell you something that might save you a lot of heartache. In my 15 years of instruction, I've recommended maybe 12 students for fighter tracks. 3 of them were women. It's not because I'm biased against women. It's because the standards don't care about your gender, your background, or how badly you want it. Major Thompson wasn't trying to discourage me, he was preparing me for the reality of what came next. Pilot training was divided into phases, each one eliminating students who couldn't keep up. Phase 1 covered basic flight fundamentals in T-6 Texan aircraft, single-engine trainers that looked almost toy-like compared to the fighters I dreamed of flying. My first solo flight came during week 6. Sitting alone in the cockpit of a T-6, watching the Texas landscape spread out below me, I finally understood what my grandfather must have felt flying over those Mexican mountains. There's a moment during your first solo when you realize you're actually flying, not just along for the ride, but in complete control of a machine that's defying gravity through your decisions alone. But that euphoria was short-lived. Academic coursework at pilot training made my aerospace engineering degree look like elementary school. We studied aerodynamics, weather systems, navigation, emergency procedures, and military regulations. Every day brought new information that could save your life or kill you, depending on how well you absorbed it. The real challenge, though, was learning to think like a military pilot. Commercial aviation focuses on safety, efficiency, and passenger comfort. Military flying is about completing missions under conditions that would ground civilian aircraft. We practiced low-level navigation at 500 feet above ground, simulated emergency scenarios that would test our decision-making under extreme stress, and learned to fly in formations so close you could read the expressions on other pilots' faces. My classmate, Lieutenant Brad Kowalski from Ohio, seemed to adapt naturally to every aspect of training. His father had been a Navy pilot, and Brad had grown up around military aviation. He flew with the kind of instinctive confidence that instructors notice immediately. During formation exercises, he maintained position with mathematical precision. In emergency scenarios, he remained calm while others, including me, struggled to work through checklist items quickly enough. The key is not to overthink, Brad told me during a study session in our shared dormitory common area. Trust your training and react. When you start analyzing every decision, that's when you make mistakes. Easy advice for someone who'd been raised around aircraft and military culture. Harder for someone who'd learned everything from scratch and felt the weight of representing everyone who'd ever doubted whether I belonged here. Week 12 brought our first check rides, comprehensive evaluations where instructors determined whether students were ready to advance to the next phase of training. I'd been struggling with instrument approaches, the complex procedures pilots use to land aircraft in poor weather conditions. The mathematical precision required to fly specific headings, altitudes, and speeds while monitoring multiple instruments simultaneously was pushing my multitasking abilities to their limits. Major Thompson administered my check ride on a cloudy December morning when actual instrument conditions made the exercise feel more real than simulation. For 90 minutes, he tested every skill I'd learned, calling out emergency scenarios and navigation problems while I tried to maintain control of the aircraft and demonstrate proficiency in basic pilot tasks. Engine fire on takeoff, he announced 5 minutes after we'd become airborne. Execute your emergency checklist. My hands moved through the memory items I'd practiced hundreds of times. Throttle to idle, mixture to idle cutoff, fuel selector to off, master switch to off. But my execution was clumsy, taking precious seconds longer than it should have. Too slow, Major Thompson said calmly. In a real emergency, those extra seconds matter. Continue with the approach. The remainder of the check ride proceeded similarly. I demonstrated competency in required areas, but without the smooth proficiency that separated good students from great ones. When we landed and debriefed in his office, Major Thompson's assessment was direct. You passed, Martinez. Barely. Your knowledge is solid, but your execution lacks the confidence required for advanced training. You need to stop flying like you're afraid of making mistakes and start flying like you trust your training. During Christmas break, I went home to California for the first time since starting pilot training. My mother had redecorated my old bedroom, adding photos from my OCS graduation and articles about women in military aviation she'd found in magazines. My father, whose back problems had worsened, seemed proud but worried about the dangers I was facing. Flying is dangerous work, mija, he said over dinner at our small kitchen table. Are you sure this is what you want? The question caught me off guard because for the first time since deciding to become a pilot, I wasn't entirely sure of the answer. Training was harder than I'd anticipated, and I was beginning to understand the difference between wanting something and being naturally suited for it. Brad Kowalski and students like him made flying look effortless, while every flight for me felt like a test I was barely passing. But during my last night home, I found myself outside again, listening to the distant sound of jets from Edwards, the same sound that had sparked my dreams years earlier. I realized that my doubts weren't about whether I wanted to fly. They were about whether I was willing to accept that I might have to work harder than everyone else to achieve the same results. Phase 2 of pilot training began in January with transition to T-38 Talons, supersonic aircraft that more closely resembled the fighters I hoped to eventually fly. The T-38 was unforgiving in ways the T-6 hadn't been. It flew faster, required more precise control inputs, and punished mistakes more severely. My first flight in a T-38 was both terrifying and exhilarating. The acceleration during takeoff pressed me back into my ejection seat with forces I'd never experienced. At altitude, the aircraft responded to control inputs with razor-sharp precision that demanded complete attention and smooth technique. "This is where we separate the pilots from the passengers," said Captain Lisa Wong, my new instructor, during our post-flight briefing. Captain Wong was one of only 3 female instructors at Laughlin, a former A-10 pilot who'd returned to training duty by choice rather than medical necessity. The T-38 will teach you everything you need to know about flying high-performance aircraft. It will also humble you in ways you can't imagine. She was right. My first few T-38 flights were exercises in controlled disaster management. I over-controlled the aircraft during formation flights, causing dangerous deviations that required instructor intervention. During simulated instrument approaches, I fell behind the aircraft's speed and found myself constantly trying to catch up rather than staying ahead of required tasks. The academic workload intensified as well. We studied advanced aerodynamics, complex navigation systems, and tactical procedures. Each evening, I spread textbooks and technical manuals across my dormitory room desk, working through practice problems until the early morning hours. My classmates seemed to manage the same workload with less visible effort, gathering in common areas to discuss weekend plans while I struggled to keep pace with assignments. 3 weeks into T-38 training, I failed my first check ride. The failure wasn't dramatic, no emergency situations or dangerous mistakes. I simply couldn't demonstrate the proficiency standards required to advance. My instrument approaches were imprecise, my formation flying was rough, and my emergency procedures, while technically correct, lacked the smooth execution expected at this level of training. Captain Wong delivered the news with characteristic directness. "Martinez, you're not ready to continue. You'll receive additional instruction and attempt another check ride in 2 weeks. Use this time to determine whether you're willing to make the changes necessary to succeed here." That night, I called my mother from the dormitory payphone, crying for the second time since beginning military training. "Maybe I'm not cut out for this," I admitted. "Maybe everyone who said I was reaching too high was right." "Rebecca," my mother said, her voice carrying the firm tone she'd used when I was a child and needed guidance. "Do you remember when you were 8 years old and wanted to join the school soccer team?" I did remember. I'd been one of the worst players during tryouts, tripping over the ball and missing easy passes while other girls demonstrated skills they'd been developing for years. "You came home that first day and said you wanted to quit because you weren't as good as the other girls. Do you remember what I told you?" "You said being as good as other people wasn't the goal. Being better than I was yesterday was the goal." Exactly. The question isn't whether you're the best pilot in your class. The question is whether you're becoming the pilot you need to be. The next morning, I approached Captain Wong after the daily flight briefing. "Ma'am, I'd like to request additional instruction beyond what's required for my recheck." Captain Wong studied me for a moment. "That's unusual, Martinez. Most students who fail rides want to do the minimum necessary to pass the recheck." "I don't want to just pass, ma'am. I want to understand why I'm struggling and fix it." "All right, meet me at aircraft 347 at 1,400 hours. We're going to figure out what's going wrong." The extra instruction with Captain Wong changed everything, but not in the way I expected. Instead of focusing on technical skills, she spent our first additional flight session watching me fly normally, saying almost nothing except basic directions. After we landed, she didn't discuss my performance. Instead, she asked an unexpected question. "Martinez, what do you think about when you're flying?" "I think about not making mistakes, ma'am, following procedures correctly, maintaining proper parameters, not doing anything that would endanger the aircraft or mission." Captain Wong nodded slowly. "That's your problem. You're flying not to fail instead of flying to succeed. There's a fundamental difference." She explained that my technical knowledge was solid, but I was approaching each flight like a test I might fail rather than an opportunity to demonstrate competence. This defensive mindset was causing me to second-guess decisions, over-control the aircraft, and miss the subtle cues that separated adequate pilots from exceptional ones. "Flying fighters requires aggressive confidence," she continued. "Not reckless aggression, but the kind of confidence that trusts your training completely and commits to decisions without hesitation. Right now, you're flying like you're apologizing for being in the cockpit." The next week of additional instruction focused on rebuilding my approach to flying. Captain Wong introduced exercises designed to push me beyond my comfort zone, forcing quick decisions without time for second-guessing. We practiced simulated combat scenarios where hesitation would mean failure, and emergency procedures where smooth, confident execution was the difference between success and disaster. During one particularly challenging flight, she shut down my engine at low altitude, simulating a catastrophic failure that required immediate action to reach an emergency airfield. My initial response was textbook perfect: airspeed control, emergency checklist execution, radio calls. But instead of the tentative flying she'd observed before, something clicked. I stopped analyzing every decision and started reacting with the confidence my training had earned. "Much better," Captain Wong said after we completed the simulated emergency landing. "That's what I want to see in your recheck ride." My second check ride took place on a crisp February morning, with Major Thompson again serving as evaluator. This time, his emergency scenarios and complex procedures felt like challenges to overcome rather than obstacles to survive. When he called for a simulated engine fire during takeoff, my response was immediate and precise. During formation flying, I maintained position with the steady confidence that comes from trusting your training completely. The ride lasted 2 hours, covering every skill required for advancement to the final phase of pilot training. When we landed, Major Thompson's debrief was brief. "Excellent flight, Martinez. You demonstrated the proficiency we expect from our advanced students. You're ready for Phase 3. Phase 3 meant assignment selection was approaching, the moment when students learned what type of aircraft they'd fly for the remainder of their Air Force careers. The process was competitive and largely based on class ranking, which combined flying performance, academic grades, and instructor recommendations. Fighter assignments went to the top 10% of each class. My improved flying performance had moved me up in class rankings, but I was still outside the fighter track range. Brad Kowalski remained near the top, along with several other students who demonstrated consistent excellence throughout training. I was in the middle tier, good enough to graduate and receive a respectable assignment, but not quite at the level required for fighters. The final phase of training involved more complex scenarios designed to simulate real-world military operations. We flew multi-ship formations, practiced air-to-air intercepts, and learned tactical procedures that would be essential regardless of our final aircraft assignments. These flights required the kind of split-second decision-making and aggressive flying that separated military pilots from their civilian counterparts. During one formation exercise, our 4-ship flight was practicing tactical approaches when Lieutenant Jennifer Hayes, flying as my wingman, experienced actual hydraulic failure. The emergency was real, not simulated, and required immediate coordination between all aircraft in the formation to ensure her safe recovery. As flight lead for the exercise, I had to make rapid decisions about airspace management, emergency procedures, and coordination with ground control while maintaining formation integrity and ensuring Hayes had clear airspace for her emergency approach. The situation required exactly the kind of confident, aggressive decision-making Captain Wong had been trying to develop in me. "Viper Flight, this is Viper 1, I called over the radio, using our assigned call signs. "Viper 2 has declared an emergency." Viper 3 and 4, establish a holding pattern at Angels 15. Viper 2, report your fuel state and intentions. For the next 20 minutes, I coordinated the emergency response while Hayes worked through her emergency checklist and prepared for a no-flap, no-gear extension landing. The exercise required constant communication, situational awareness, and the kind of leadership skills the Air Force expected from its pilots. Hayes landed safely, and the post-flight debrief focused on the emergency procedures and coordination that had made the recovery successful. Major Thompson, who'd been monitoring the situation from ground control, made notes throughout our debrief that I assumed were routine documentation. 2 weeks before assignment selection, Major Thompson called me into his office for what I expected to be a routine progress meeting. Instead, he had my complete training file spread across his desk, along with what appeared to be official correspondence. Martinez, I've been reviewing your progress throughout pilot training. Your initial performance was adequate but unremarkable. However, your development over the past few months has been exceptional. More importantly, your performance during Lieutenant Hayes' emergency demonstrated the kind of leadership and decision-making ability we look for in fighter pilots. He paused, studying documents I couldn't read from my position across his desk. I'm recommending you for fighter track consideration. That doesn't guarantee you'll receive a fighter assignment, but it puts you in competition with the top students in your class. The recommendation felt surreal. 6 months earlier, I'd barely passed my first T-38 check ride. Now I was being considered for the assignment I'd dreamed about since those afternoons in Bakersfield, watching contrails cross the desert sky. Assignment night arrived with all the ceremony and tension the Air Force could manufacture. Our entire class gathered in the base auditorium, while instructors read assignments in order of class ranking. The top performers received their first choice assignments: F-22s, F-35s, F-16s. The middle tier received solid assignments in cargo, transport, and tanker aircraft. Those at the bottom received whatever remained. As a borderline student who'd received a late recommendation for fighter track, my assignment would come somewhere in the middle of the list. I sat with my classmates, watching dreams come true or die with each announcement. Brad Kowalski received F-22s, as everyone expected. Several other top students received various fighter assignments. When they called my name, I felt my heart stop. Second Lieutenant Rebecca Martinez, F-16 Fighting Falcons, Luke Air Force Base, Arizona. The auditorium erupted in applause from my classmates, but I barely heard it. F-16s, single-seat fighters. The aircraft I'd dreamed about but never truly believed I'd be qualified to fly. After the ceremony, Captain Wong approached me during the reception. "Congratulations, Martinez, you earned this." "Thank you, ma'am. I couldn't have done it without the additional instruction and guidance you provided." "The instruction helped, but the transformation came from you. You stopped flying like you were afraid to fail, and started flying like you deserved to succeed. That's the difference between adequate pilots and fighter pilots." The next morning, I called my mother with the news. "F-16s, Misha? Those are the ones we see over the house sometimes?" "Yes, Mama, single-seat fighters. Some of the most advanced aircraft in the world." "And they're gonna let you fly these by yourself?" "After a lot more training, yes." There was a long pause on the line. When my mother spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. "Your grandfather would be so proud, we all are." Luke Air Force Base in Arizona would be my next assignment for F-16 training, but first came a brief leave period to visit family and prepare for the next phase of my career. Driving through Bakersfield on my way home, I stopped at the grocery store where I'd worked throughout college. Doug was still there, still wearing his crooked name tag, still looking perpetually tired. When he saw me in my flight suit, his expression shifted from surprise to something approaching awe. "Rebecca, is that really you?" "Hi, Doug. I wanted to stop by and say thank you." "Thank me? For what?" "For being wrong about people like us keeping our feet on the ground. Sometimes being wrong is exactly what someone needs to hear." Doug laughed, the same laugh I remembered from years of afternoon shifts and weekend inventory counts. "Well, I'll be damned, you actually did it. You're really going to be flying those jets." "Yes, sir. F-16s." "F-16s, he repeated, shaking his head in amazement. "And here I thought you were just a dreamer, stocking shelves and watching airplanes." I looked up through the store's front windows at the clear desert sky where, somewhere above, other pilots were flying the same aircraft I'd soon be learning to operate. The contrails looked different now, not like impossible dreams, but like paths I was finally qualified to follow. Luke Air Force Base in Arizona felt like entering a different universe. The flight lines stretched endlessly under the desert sun, packed with rows of F-16 Fighting Falcons that looked nothing like the training aircraft I'd grown accustomed to. These were real weapons of war, sleek, angular machines designed for one purpose: air-to-air and air-to-ground combat. On my first day at the 56th Fighter Wing, I joined 12 other newly assigned pilots in what the Air Force called B-Course training, the final step before becoming mission-qualified fighter pilots. Unlike pilot training, where everyone eventually graduated to some aircraft assignment, F-16 training had a 20% washout rate. Students who failed here would be reassigned to other aircraft, their fighter pilot dreams permanently ended. The other students in my class represented the cream of their respective pilot training classes. Lieutenant Marcus Webb had been number 1 at Vance Air Force Base. Captain Angela Torres was a prior enlisted airman who'd worked her way through college and pilot training while supporting 2 children as a single mother. Lieutenant Ryan Foster came from a family of Air Force pilots dating back to World War II and flew with the natural confidence that suggested aviation was literally in his DNA. Our first briefing came from Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Reynolds, the B-Course Squadron Commander, a combat veteran with over 2,000 hours in F-16s and deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. She stood before our small group in a briefing room decorated with photographs of previous classes, unit patches, and combat mission markers. "Congratulations on making it this far," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd led fighter squadrons in actual combat. "But understand that everything you've accomplished to this point was preparation for what begins now. F-16 training will push you beyond every limit you think you have. The aircraft is unforgiving, the mission requirements are complex, and the standards are absolute." She clicked through slides showing training statistics, mission profiles, and aircraft capabilities while explaining what the next 8 months would demand from us. Academic coursework would cover advanced fighter tactics, weapons systems, electronic warfare, and air-to-air combat principles. Flying training would progress from basic aircraft familiarization to simulated combat scenarios that replicated real-world operational requirements. "Look around this room," Lieutenant Colonel Reynolds continued. "Statistically, 2 or 3 of you won't complete this program. It's not because you're bad pilots. You wouldn't be here if you were. It's because fighter pilot training requires a specific combination of technical proficiency, tactical thinking, and aggressive decision-making that not everyone possesses." My first F-16 flight was scheduled for week 3, after extensive ground school covering aircraft systems, emergency procedures, and basic fighter maneuvers. The F-16 was infinitely more complex than any aircraft I'd previously flown. Instead of basic flight controls and simple navigation systems, the cockpit contained multi-mission computers, radar displays, weapon control panels, and electronic warfare equipment that required constant management during flight operations. Major Scott Henderson, my assigned instructor pilot, had the weathered appearance and quiet intensity common among combat veterans. During our pre-flight briefing, he explained that my first flight would focus on basic aircraft handling and emergency procedures. "The F-16 is different from anything you've flown," he said while reviewing the flight plan. "It's fly-by-wire, which means computer systems interpret your control inputs and translate them into aircraft responses. The jet is inherently unstable, which makes it extremely maneuverable, but also requires constant attention. If you stop flying for even a few seconds, the aircraft will quickly depart controlled flight." Walking out to the aircraft for the first time felt like approaching something from science fiction. The F-16 sat low to the ground, its bubble canopy providing 360-degree visibility and its single-engine inlet giving it a predatory appearance that suggested speed and lethality. The pre-flight inspection required checking hundreds of systems, panels, and components that could affect flight safety or mission capability. Strapping into the ejection seat, I was surrounded by displays, switches, and controls that seemed impossibly complex after the relatively simple cockpits of training aircraft. The heads-up display projected flight information directly onto the windscreen, while multifunction displays showed radar information, navigation data, and system status indicators that required constant monitoring. Engine start procedures alone involved dozens of steps, each one critical for safe operation. As the Pratt & Whitney engine spooled up behind me, the entire aircraft vibrated with barely contained power that made previous flying experiences seem gentle by comparison. Viper 21, you're cleared for takeoff, came the call from ground control, using the F-16's operational call sign. Major Henderson walked me through the takeoff procedures. Full afterburner, release brakes, monitor engine parameters, rotate at precisely the correct airspeed. The acceleration was unlike anything I'd experienced. A sustained push that pressed me deep into the seat while the runway disappeared beneath us at an alarming rate. At altitude, Major Henderson demonstrated basic aircraft handling while explaining the fundamental differences between flying fighters and flying any other type of aircraft. Every control input had to be precise and deliberate. The aircraft responded instantly to pilot commands, but it also punished imprecision, with rapid departures from controlled flight that required immediate corrective action. Your job is to stay ahead of the jet, he explained, while demonstrating high G turns that pulled blood away from my brain and made simple tasks like reading instruments require enormous concentration. The F-16 will go wherever you point it, as fast as you want, pulling as many Gs as you can tolerate. But if you're not thinking 2 or 3 steps ahead, it will quickly overwhelm your ability to keep up. That first flight lasted 90 minutes and covered basic maneuvers, emergency procedures, and aircraft limitations. When we landed, I felt simultaneously exhilarated and humbled. The F-16 was everything I'd dreamed of flying, but it demanded a level of precision and situational awareness that would require months of training to develop. Academic coursework proceeded in parallel with flying training, covering tactical principles that transformed abstract military theory into practical application. We studied air-to-air combat tactics, learning how to employ radar and weapon systems to engage enemy aircraft beyond visual range. Air-to-ground training covered precision bombing techniques, close air support procedures, and electronic warfare principles that modern combat operations required. The classroom work was intellectually demanding, but the real challenge came during flight training as we progressed from basic aircraft handling to tactical flying. Formation flying in F-16s required maintaining position while managing complex aircraft systems and monitoring tactical radio frequencies. Air-to-air intercepts demanded split-second decision-making while operating radar systems and weapon controls that could engage targets at distances measured in tens of miles. My biggest struggle came during basic fighter maneuver training, where we learned air-to-air combat techniques that fighter pilots had developed over decades of operational experience. These flights involved aggressive maneuvering at high G-forces while trying to gain tactical advantage over simulated enemy aircraft flown by instructor pilots. During one particularly challenging training flight, I found myself in a defensive position against Major Henderson, who was simulating an enemy fighter attacking from my rear quarter. Standard defensive procedures required a series of high G turns designed to force the attacking aircraft to overshoot and present a targeting opportunity for counterattack. The maneuver pulled nearly 8 gigaseconds, creating forces that made my body feel like it weighed over 1,000 pounds and threatened to render me unconscious if I couldn't maintain proper breathing and muscle tension techniques. While fighting the physical effects of high G maneuvering, I also had to monitor radar displays, manage defensive electronic warfare systems, and execute tactical radio calls that kept other aircraft informed of my situation. I executed the maneuver correctly from a technical standpoint, but Major Henderson's debrief highlighted deficiencies in my tactical thinking and situational awareness. Martinez, your aircraft handling was adequate, but you flew the maneuver instead of fighting the engagement. There's a difference. You were so focused on executing proper procedures that you missed opportunities to gain tactical advantage and transition from defensive to offensive positioning. This became a recurring theme in my training feedback. My technical flying skills were progressing appropriately, but I was still approaching each flight like a pilot training exercise rather than tactical combat training. Fighter pilot training required a fundamental shift from flying aircraft to employing aircraft as weapons systems in complex tactical scenarios. The transformation came gradually through repeated exposure to increasingly complex scenarios that forced me to think tactically while managing multiple tasks simultaneously. During air-to-ground training flights, I learned to navigate at low altitude while identifying and engaging ground targets with precision-guided munitions. The missions required constant coordination with ground controllers, adherence to complex airspace restrictions, and split-second decision-making about target identification and weapon employment. Captain Torres, who'd initially struggled with similar tactical thinking challenges, offered advice during one of our post-flight debriefs. "The key is learning to trust your basic flying skills completely," she explained. "Once aircraft handling becomes automatic, you can focus mental bandwidth on tactical problems and mission execution. Right now, you're still thinking too much about flying the jet instead of fighting with it." My breakthrough came during a simulated combat mission in month 5 of training. The scenario involved a complex air-to-ground strike against defended targets, requiring coordination with multiple aircraft, electronic warfare support, and precise timing to achieve mission objectives while avoiding simulated surface-to-air missiles and enemy fighters. Instead of focusing on individual tasks, I found myself thinking several steps ahead, anticipating problems and preparing solutions before they became critical. When simulated enemy fighters appeared on radar, my response was immediate and tactical rather than procedural. I engaged the threat while continuing to monitor the primary mission, coordinated with other aircraft in the package, and maintained situational awareness of the overall tactical picture. "Much better, Martinez," Major Henderson said during the post-mission debrief. "That's what we want to see. You flew that mission like a fighter pilot, not like a student going through training exercises." The comment represented more than performance feedback. It was recognition that I was finally developing the tactical mindset that separated fighter pilots from other aviators. Instead of executing procedures, I was solving tactical problems. Instead of flying aircraft, I was employing weapon systems in complex operational scenarios. With 4 months of training remaining, I was finally beginning to understand what it meant to be a fighter pilot. But the most challenging phases of training still lay ahead, including weapons employment, advanced tactical scenarios, and the final check rides that would determine whether I was qualified to join an operational fighter squadron. The final 4 months of F-16 training transformed everything I thought I understood about flying. Advanced weapons employment training introduced complexities that made previous challenges seem elementary by comparison. We learned to engage multiple targets simultaneously, coordinate with ground forces in close air support missions, and employ precision-guided munitions in scenarios that replicated real-world combat operations. My first live weapons training flight took place at the Barry Goldwater Range, a vast expanse of Arizona desert dotted with target complexes and instrumentation systems that could measure weapon accuracy to within inches. Loading live ordnance onto an F-16 felt like crossing a threshold from training to actual military operations. The 500-pound practice bombs hanging beneath my aircraft represented real destructive capability that I would soon learn to employ with surgical precision. Major Henderson briefed the mission with the serious tone reserved for flights involving actual weapons. "Today we transition from simulation to reality. The weapons you're carrying can kill people and destroy targets. Every decision you make from engine start to engine shutdown must reflect that responsibility." The mission profile involved low-altitude navigation to multiple target areas, positive identification of specific targets using onboard sensors, and weapons employment while avoiding simulated threats and maintaining coordination with other aircraft. The cognitive workload was enormous, managing aircraft systems, navigating complex routes, operating targeting sensors, and making split-second decisions about weapon employment while flying at 400 knots just 500 feet above the desert floor. My first bomb run was technically successful but lacked the smooth precision that characterized experienced fighter pilots. I identified the correct target, programmed the weapon systems appropriately, and released ordnance within acceptable parameters. But my execution was mechanical rather than intuitive, requiring conscious thought for tasks that should have become automatic responses. "Adequate," Major Henderson said during the post-flight debrief, reviewing gun camera footage that showed my targeting and weapon employment. "Your procedures were correct, but your execution still looks like you're working through checklist items rather than employing a weapons system. We need to see more aggressive, confident attacks." The feedback was frustrating because I could feel the gap between my current performance and the standard expected of operational fighter pilots. My classmates, who'd adapted more quickly to tactical thinking, were demonstrating the kind of smooth, aggressive flying that characterized combat veterans. Lieutenant Foster's weapon runs looked effortless, combining precise navigation with smooth target acquisition and immediate attack execution. Captain Torres had overcome her initial tactical struggles and was now demonstrating the kind of multitasking ability that allowed her to manage complex missions while maintaining situational awareness of threats and other aircraft. The pressure intensified during advanced tactical training, where we practiced scenarios that replicated actual combat operations. These missions involved packages of multiple aircraft with different roles: fighters providing air-to-air protection, electronic warfare aircraft jamming enemy communications, and strike aircraft attacking ground targets. My role as a strike pilot required coordinating with numerous other aircraft while navigating to target areas, avoiding surface-to-air missile threats, and employing weapons against defended targets. During one particularly complex mission, our four-ship formation was tasked with destroying a high-value target defended by simulated surface-to-air missiles and enemy fighters. The mission required precise timing to coordinate electronic warfare support, fighter escort, and strike aircraft attacks while maintaining radio communication with multiple agencies and monitoring constantly changing threat information. As mission commander for this exercise, I was responsible for overall coordination and decision-making. The leadership role demanded tactical thinking at a level I'd never experienced, constantly evaluating threats, modifying attack plans based on changing conditions, and making decisions that affected the safety and mission success of all aircraft in the package. Viper flight bandits bearing 090 30 miles and closing called the air-to-air fighter providing escort for our strike package. Enemy fighters were approaching our formation, requiring immediate tactical decisions about whether to continue the attack or abort the mission to engage the air-to-air threat. Viper 31, continue with primary target, I responded, directing the escort fighters to engage the threat while our strike aircraft proceeded with the planned attack. Viper 21 and 22, accelerate attack timeline. We need to be off target before those bandits penetrate our defensive perimeter. The next 10 minutes required constant decision-making and coordination while managing my own aircraft through a complex attack profile. I had to monitor the progress of air-to-air engagements, adjust our attack route to avoid surface-to-air missile threats, coordinate weapon employment with my wingman, and maintain overall situational awareness of a tactical picture that changed every few seconds. When we completed the mission and returned to base, Major Henderson's debrief was different from previous feedback. Outstanding mission leadership, Martinez. You demonstrated the kind of tactical thinking and decision-making ability we expect from mission commanders. More importantly, you made those decisions while executing your own attack responsibilities. That's the multitasking ability that separates good pilots from exceptional ones. The comment represented a turning point in my training progression. Instead of struggling to keep up with course requirements, I was beginning to demonstrate the tactical proficiency expected of operational fighter pilots. But the most challenging test still lay ahead. Final check rides that would determine whether I was qualified to join an operational squadron. B-Corps graduation requirements included comprehensive evaluations in all mission areas: air-to-air combat, air-to-ground attack, navigation, emergency procedures, and tactical leadership. The check rides were administered by senior instructor pilots and covered scenarios that replicated operational mission requirements. Students who failed any portion of the evaluation would either receive additional training or be eliminated from the program, depending on the nature and severity of their deficiencies. My final check ride was scheduled with Lieutenant Colonel Reynolds, the squadron commander who'd briefed our class on the first day of training. Her reputation for thorough, demanding evaluations was legendary among F-16 students, and she had personally eliminated several students who failed to meet her standards during final check rides. The mission profile she designed was diabolical in its complexity. A multi-phase scenario that began with air-to-air combat, transitioned to air-to-ground attack, and concluded with simulated battle damage that required emergency procedures and formation flying with degraded aircraft systems. The scenario was designed to test every skill I'd learned during 8 months of intensive training, compressed into a single 2-hour flight that would determine my future as a fighter pilot. Martinez, Lieutenant Colonel Reynolds said during the pre-flight briefing, reviewing the mission timeline and evaluation criteria. This check ride will test your ability to think tactically under pressure while managing multiple tasks simultaneously. I'm not looking for perfect execution of individual procedures. I'm evaluating your ability to employ an F-16 as a weapons system in complex operational scenarios. The flight began with simulated air-to-air combat against instructor pilots flying as enemy fighters. The engagement required aggressive maneuvering at high G-forces while operating radar systems, managing electronic warfare equipment, and coordinating with other aircraft in my formation. Instead of the tentative flying that had characterized my early training, I attacked the problem with the kind of confident aggression that Lieutenant Colonel Reynolds wanted to see. Viper 21 Fox 2, I called over the radio, simulating a heat-seeking missile shot against an enemy fighter that had made the mistake of presenting a thermal signature within my weapon engagement envelope. The engagement was textbook perfect. I'd gained tactical advantage through superior positioning and employed weapons at the optimal moment to achieve a simulated kill. The air-to-ground phase required navigation to multiple target areas, while avoiding simulated surface-to-air missile threats, and coordinating with ground controllers who provided target updates and clearances for weapon employment. Each target required different attack profiles and weapon systems, testing my ability to rapidly reconfigure aircraft systems while maintaining situational awareness of threats and other aircraft. During the final target attack, Lieutenant Colonel Reynolds introduced simulated battle damage that affected my aircraft's flight control systems and hydraulic pressure. The malfunction required immediate emergency procedures while continuing to fly formation with other aircraft and navigate back to base with degraded capabilities. Viper 21, you're showing hydraulic pressure fluctuations and flight control anomalies, she announced over the intercom, simulating damage from enemy surface-to-air missiles. Execute your emergency checklist and report your status. The emergency procedures were complex, requiring me to configure aircraft systems for degraded operations while maintaining formation position and coordinating with other aircraft about my aircraft's condition. Instead of panicking or becoming fixated on the emergency, I worked through the required procedures while continuing to fly tactically and maintaining awareness of the overall mission situation. Viper 21 has executed emergency procedures for hydraulic and flight control malfunctions, I reported to the formation leader. Aircraft is controllable, with degraded capabilities, requesting direct routing to base and emergency equipment standing by. The remainder of the flight involved flying a degraded aircraft back to base while maintaining formation position and executing approach procedures with backup flight control systems. The scenario tested not only my technical knowledge of emergency procedures, but also my ability to maintain tactical thinking and formation responsibilities while dealing with aircraft malfunctions. When we landed and completed the post-flight debrief, Lieutenant Colonel Reynolds was thorough but positive in her evaluation. Excellent check ride, Martinez. You demonstrated tactical proficiency in all mission areas, maintained situational awareness throughout complex scenarios, and executed emergency procedures without compromising mission effectiveness or flight safety. You're qualified for assignment to an operational fighter squadron. B-Course graduation took place on a Friday afternoon, in the same auditorium where Lieutenant Colonel Reynolds had briefed our class 8 months earlier. Of the 13 students who began training, 11 graduated to operational assignments. 2 had been eliminated during weapons training for deficiencies in tactical thinking and mission execution. As I sat with my surviving classmates listening to speeches about fighter pilot heritage and operational responsibilities, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 3 years earlier, I'd been stocking shelves in a Bakersfield grocery store, watching contrails cross the desert sky and dreaming about flying. Now I was a mission-qualified F-16 pilot, ready for assignment to an operational squadron, where I'd employ the world's most advanced fighter aircraft in real-world military operations. My first operational assignment was to the 388th Fighter Wing at Hill Air Force Base in Utah, a combat-experienced unit with recent deployments to both Iraq and Afghanistan. The squadron I joined had a reputation for aggressive training and high operational standards, exactly the kind of environment where new pilots either succeeded rapidly or struggled to keep pace with experienced combat veterans. But first came 30 days of leave before reporting to my new assignment. I drove home to California for the first time since beginning F-16 training, planning to spend time with my family before beginning the next phase of my military career. The reception at home was different from previous visits. My parents had invited extended family and neighbors to welcome home their daughter who'd become a fighter pilot. The gathering included people I'd known since childhood, many of whom had watched me grow up in a neighborhood where military service was uncommon, and fighter pilots seemed like characters from movies rather than real people they might actually know. My cousin Maria, who'd graduated from high school the same year I'd enlisted, approached me during the party with questions about military life and aviation careers. "I never thought anyone from our family would become a pilot," she said, studying my flight suit and pilot wings with obvious fascination. "How did you know you could do it?" The question made me think about all the moments of doubt I'd experienced during training, all the times I'd wondered whether I was reaching beyond my capabilities or pursuing dreams that belonged to other people from different backgrounds. "I didn't know I could do it," I admitted. "I just knew I had to try. The worst thing that could happen was failing, and I was already living a life that felt like settling for less than I was capable of achieving." "But weren't you afraid of not being good enough?" "Terrified. Every single day. But I learned that being afraid of failing and actually failing are two completely different things. Fear is just a feeling. It doesn't determine what you're capable of accomplishing." On my last day of leave, I drove through Bakersfield one final time, past the grocery store where I'd worked, past the community college where I'd first heard Captain Chen's presentation, past all the places that had shaped my decision to pursue military aviation. The city looked the same, but my perspective had changed completely. I stopped at the overlook where I used to watch aircraft from Edwards Air Force Base cross the sky. The same contrails were still visible, but now I understood the training, dedication, and sacrifice they represented. More importantly, I understood that some of those contrails were being made by pilots who'd started their journeys in places just like this, from backgrounds similar to mine. My phone rang as I sat in my car watching the afternoon sky. The caller ID showed my new squadron commander at Hill Air Force Base. "Lieutenant Martinez, this is Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell, 421st Fighter Squadron. I wanted to welcome you to the Blackjacks and discuss your arrival timeline." "Thank you, sir. I'm planning to report as scheduled next Monday." "Outstanding. I've reviewed your training records and talked to your instructors at Luke. They had excellent things to say about your development as a tactical pilot. I'm looking forward to having you join our squadron." After the call ended, I sat in my car for several more minutes, watching contrails cross the desert sky and thinking about the journey that had brought me to this moment. Tomorrow, I would drive to Utah and begin my career as an operational F-16 pilot, employing the world's most advanced fighter aircraft in missions that defended American interests around the world. The path from grocery store clerk to fighter pilot had required sacrifices, dedication, and a willingness to pursue dreams that many people thought were beyond my reach. But sitting in that car, wearing the flight suit and pilot wings I'd earned through years of training, I finally understood what my mother had meant when she'd said that being as good as other people wasn't the goal. Being better than I was yesterday was the goal. I was an AT. 3 months later, I was flying combat air patrol missions over restricted airspace, employing the tactical skills I'd learned during training to protect American territory from potential threats. My aircraft was an F-16C Block 50, tail number 910353, equipped with the most advanced radar and weapon systems in the Air Force inventory. But the moment that brought everything full circle came during a training flight over Nevada, not far from where I'd grown up watching contrails cross the desert sky. I was leading a 4-ship formation of F-16s through a complex tactical exercise when ground control provided a routing that would take us directly over Bakersfield. Viper flight cleared direct Bakersfield VOR, maintained flight level 300. As we approached the city where my journey had begun, I thought about all the people who doubted whether someone from my background could achieve this kind of success. I thought about Doug at the grocery store, Professor Williams who'd seemed skeptical of my abilities, and all the moments during training when I'd wondered whether they were right. But mostly I thought about the young woman who'd spent afternoons watching aircraft cross the sky and dreaming about flying, never imagining that she was looking at her own future. Viper 21, this is Bakersfield Approach Control. Radar contact, maintain current heading and altitude. Bakersfield Approach, Viper 21. Good afternoon. As our formation passed over the city, I could see the grocery store where I'd worked, the college where I'd met Captain Chen, and the neighborhoods where I'd grown up, believing that people like me didn't become fighter pilots. They'd called me just a cadet during those early days of training, when my performance was adequate but unremarkable. Now I was Captain Rebecca Martinez, an operational F-16 pilot qualified to employ America's premier multi-role fighter aircraft anywhere in the world. The contrail I was creating as I flew over Bakersfield would be visible to anyone who happened to look up at the afternoon sky. Maybe some young person down there was watching, wondering what it would be like to fly, thinking that dreams like that belonged to other people from different places. I hoped they were wrong about that. I hoped they would learn what I'd learned, that the distance between dreaming about something and achieving it is measured not in impossibility, but in dedication, training, and a willingness to pursue goals that other people think are beyond your reach. 20,000 feet above the city where my journey began, surrounded by the blue sky and distant hum of a Pratt & Whitney engine, I finally understood what they meant when they said, "Flying changes you." But this time I knew exactly where I belonged. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.